Hey, this is Miss Dellosso, and today we're going to talk about the attributes of life, or also known as the characteristics of life. Alright, so let's go on. Let's say, for example, I showed you a couple of things here. A rock, some batteries, a tree, some cute snow leopard cubs, bacteria cells, or this guy over here. Which of these things are considered living? And when you think about it, how did you make that assumption that something is living? What characteristics about the thing or organism makes it considered living? So today we are actually going to get to 10 different characteristics or attributes that all living things must have in order to be considered alive. The 10 attributes of life. Number 1, living things must exhibit movement. Number 2, living things must achieve growth. Number 3, living things are capable of reproducing. They don't have to reproduce in order to stay alive for the organism. Number 4, they must come from similar pre-existing life. Number 5, have a similar chemical makeup. Number 6, living things are composed of one or more cells. Number 7, living things exhibit irritability or response. Number 8, living things require energy. And number 9, they maintain a high level of organization. And finally, last, all living things will eventually face death. So here are the 10 characteristics that all living things must actually have in order to be considered alive. And as we go through this PowerPoint, we're going to go through each of these 10 things and go a little bit further in depth with them. So the first thing we're going to talk about is exhibit movement. And there are two types of movement that we're going to talk about. One is locomotion. And that's simply moving from one place to another. So example, me moving here to there, that's locomotion, right? And the second thing that we're going to talk about is internal movement. What about those organisms that we don't actually observe moving as like we do? Those things actually move internally. For example, over here, if we take a look at a plant, plants actually draw their water up from the roots and they take it to the rest of the parts of the plant. And that's internal movement, the ability for them to move the water and nutrients around in their system there. And also cells. Cells also can exhibit internal movement. And here's a basic eukaryotic cell that we're going to talk about later on, but these organelles within here, they'll move around. All right, so that's internal movement. So two types of movement that we're talking about: locomotion, that's moving around, and internal movement, when organisms move things within. All right, second thing, living things must achieve growth. So organisms grow by assimilation, and assimilation can be defined as the assembling of their component parts that make up their living material. For example, you right now, you're still growing. How are you going to grow from the height you are to the height you'll be when around 18 years old? Your body uses the nutrients that you get from the food that you eat to produce more cells and more components that will make you grow, right? For example, me right here. How did I get from here to the whole 5 feet that I am? By growth, by using the nutrients that I receive from the food. One thing to not get confused about here, even though some things can exhibit growth, here these are actually called stalagmites, and these are actually rock deposits here that drip down from the ceiling over here, and it causes these things to grow. Now, even though these things look like they're growing, they're not actually considered living, so don't get too confused about that. Living things grow. Even when you reach your full height, how do older people still grow? Well, your cells are going to be worn out and replace each other. That's growing too. All right, 3 organisms are capable of producing more of their kind, and that even goes back to single cells or cells in general. So cells can reproduce, and here we have a cell reproducing by mitosis. It's actually going to produce a genetically identical copy of itself here. All right, that's reproduction. Or organisms can also make more of their own kind. For example, dogs, right? They can reproduce to make more of their own kind. Some of their offspring, they're probably not going to be genetically identical. They're going to be similar. There will be some variability there, but to an extent. All right, number 4, come from similar pre-existing life. Biogenesis is the idea that life can only come from life, right? That's it. And that we looked at comes from other or similar life. We looked at the experiment with the maggots and the meat, and what we observed from Meddy's experiment was that living things do not spontaneously generate from meat. If we also take a look here, this was an experiment done by Pasteur, a French chemist here in the 1800s, conducted an experiment to see that life can't just spontaneously generate from no life over here. And here what he used were these flasks right here, had this broth, and he boiled it, right, so that there would be no microorganisms living there. And over time, because of this, was like S-like shape here in this tube here, any microorganisms were found down here, which means that they didn't generate from this broth, right? The other side of that, to look at that, when he didn't have that curve right there, because this was open, he could see the growth of the microorganisms there. But based on this here, it shows that life does not spontaneously generate. So we use the term biogenesis. Life could only come from pre-existing life. Number 5, living things have a similar chemical makeup. So one way you're going to remember this is CHON, and what CHON is going to actually stand for is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And if you look up these elements, you'll find these on the periodic table. And these 4 elements basically make up or are the elements of life. All living things are made up of these elements, and these elements actually will form to combine to make biological molecules. And we're going to get to those molecules a little later on, but for example, your lipids. Lipids are fats, right? Those are going to be made from the carbon and hydrogen bonds that are in that there. Proteins, they'll include the nitrogen in there as well. So all of these things will form in order to form biological molecules, and those would be our organic compounds. And we're going to talk about this later on. But the main thing to understand right now is that all living things are made up of these elements, which will combine to form the biological molecules. All right, number 6, living things are composed of 1 or more cells. So what we're going to do right now, I'm just going to give you the levels of organization of life. So here we have a cell, right? The cells are the smallest unit of life. So a single cell, is it considered living? Yes, it is. The organelles that are within the cell, however, are not considered living. The cell as a whole is considered living. So when you have groups of cells that are working together, those form tissues. When you have groups of tissues that work together and similar in function, they form organs, like your heart. When you have organs that are working together, then you form organ systems, right? Like your brain, spinal cord, that'll form your nervous system. Next, we're going to look at organisms exhibit irritability or response. So irritability simply means the capacity of an organism to respond to stimuli. For example here, if we're taking a look at this plant, it can respond to or grow in the direction in which sunlight actually moves. So as you can see here, the plant is bending, and that's because it's probably bending toward the direction at which the light is coming from. How humans respond, for example, when you're chilly, you want to put on a jacket to keep warm, or when you touch a hot stove and you immediately jump back, that's a response as well, a response to a stimuli. So again, irritability, also similar to response. All right, all living things require energy. Where do you get the energy in order to sit during class, in order to think, in order to do and carry out all life functions? That all comes from the food that you eat, right? And here's a simple pyramid of all the things, different types of foods here. But also some organisms, they don't necessarily eat, but they still require energy. And what I mean by that, plants, they can actually make their own food through the process of photosynthesis, so they're not really considered eating, but other organisms like us, cats, dogs, they actually consume their food. Your body will digest, break the food down, and use those molecules that your body will need for life in order to provide your cells with energy. So all living things, single cell, all the way up to complex organisms like us, require energy. Number 9, maintain a high level of organization. Complex organized molecules forms the structures of living things. Again, when you eat food, your body breaks it down or digests it and use those molecules in order to make who you are. And that's an organized way of making things in your body. When your body fails to do that any longer, or you're not receiving the nutrients that you need, eventually the body or other organisms, any living thing, will eventually face death. So that sums it up for the 10 attributes or characteristics of life.